what I'm planning to do today, as I said before, is basically to give you some basic information on on how I plan to organize the course, and also to provide a brief introduction to the topic that will be at the center of our classes. So this is the second part of the Economics of Globalization course. The first part that you did is with Professor Bayardi, and was mainly concerned with macroeconomic aspects of globalization, international trade, and things like that. In our second part, instead, we will be more focused on microeconomics aspects of globalization. Okay, and in few slides, it will be clear what I mean by this. So just to give you an idea of the topic, I mean, the general topic, which is globalization, and in particular the economics of globalization. It's obviously a pretty central one nowadays, and pretty debated one. Just to give you some flavor of the reason why it is a debated topic, it is interesting to compare these two different statements. One by Trump, that was made in 2016 during the presidential campaign. Notice that the US has been for a long time a pretty strong supporter of globalization via different types of tools and organization, which was that US was supporting both politically and economically. However, since the Trump presidency, this approach to globalization by the US has changed a lot. And for instance, during the presidential campaign, Trump was just saying something like the large global businesses are among the greatest enemies of American people. His argument is basically that US companies that are moving production abroad, for instance, moving production to China or moving production to other parts that are outside the US, other countries that are outside the US, of course, these companies create. I mean, they creates problem for American people because there are lots of US people losing their jobs because of this production moving into other countries. So one country that was a pretty strong supporter of globalization nowadays has become a pretty sort of like, it has become pretty critical with respect to the importance and the role of globalization. On the other hand, another country that at the beginning was not a supporter at all of globalization, which is China, has nowadays become a pretty strong supporter. For instance, 1 year later, Xi Jinping, which is the president of China, said something like globalization as the power, as powered global growth and let's see if I can move this here. Okay, has powered global growth and facilitated advances in science and civilization. So there has been a very strong reversal in the approach that the two main countries in the world have with respect to globalization. And some people now argue that, in fact, we live in a period. Let's see if this goes. Okay, it's very slow. That's why. Okay, so there is some people arguing and questioning whether we are actually in a period in which globalization is under attack. Okay, and so I think an interesting beginning for our course could be just to ask this, and this will also tell you some more. Slowly we will get to the point of this class, which is to tell you what will be the subject of our analysis. But to get there, we can ask about why is globalization under attack? So what are the issues with globalization? There are several of them. And I will just now show you some graph, some data that helps understanding what are the drawbacks or the costs as well as the advantages of globalization. So this is the first graph. This shows you over time, starting from 1870 up to 2020. It shows you the evolution, the trends of different types of measures. So the red line is the foreign capital stock, So it's the share of capital stock that is owned around the world by foreign companies. Okay, so is foreign capital owned as a share of world GDP owned around the world, and it gives you an idea of how interrelated are production activities around the world. And as you see, you can clearly identify two waves of globalization. The first one that got his peak at the beginning of the 1900s. Then there was, after the crisis of the 30s and the Second World War, there was a strong decline in this share of foreign capital stock, and then there was after the Second World War a strong increase again. So these two, let's say, these two peaks now is peaking now again around the early 2000, identify the so-called two waves of globalization: the first globalization and the second globalization that started started after the Second World War and has his peak during this period. This trend is reflected also by the blue line, although at a different scale. The blue line is merchandise export as a share of GDP. So it's not capital owned in different countries, but it's goods that are exported around the world. It's the value of these exports as a share of global GDP. And again, you can see that there are these two trends. In particular, the second wave of globalization. In the second wave of globalization, this trend is, let's say, faster than during the first wave. The other side of the coin, on one hand, which is an issue, but it can be an issue, and it is an issue actually, is the yellow line, because the yellow line instead shows you the stock of migrant population. So it's the share of population, of global population, that is moving around the world. And as you can see, this goes well together with the two waves in the share of capital stock and in the share of merchandise exports. And why this is the second share of the second, let's say, side of the coin? It is the second side of the coin because, of course, as we know also from the Italian news, the movement of people around countries creates social problems, social tensions. Not always, but in particular in periods in which the economy is not growing a lot. And this, in particular, is true for the period that was around the 1930, which is the first Great Depression, and then the Great Crisis that started from 2008 in Europe, and in Italy in particular.